She thought she was inheriting a worthless ruin hidden deep in the mountains. Everyone else had written it off as a mistake. But when powerful people began offering her millions to walk away, she realized the truth was far bigger and far more dangerous than anyone had admitted. This is the story of a forgotten fortress, a hidden legacy, and a single decision that changed everything. Stay with us, because what was hidden behind those stone walls was never meant to be found. Lauren Hale had learned to measure her life in small, practical victories. A rent payment made on time, a refrigerator that stayed full through the end of the week, a used car that started on cold mornings without protest. She lived with her son in a modest apartment outside Pittsburgh, close enough to the city for work, but far enough away to be overlooked by most of the world. Her days followed a rigid rhythm shaped by necessity rather than ambition. She worked multiple jobs, none of them permanent, all of them demanding. There was little room for dreaming, and even less for mistakes. Every decision she made carried weight, and every risk threatened the fragile balance she had built. Her family history had never offered her much comfort. The Hale name meant little to anyone who heard it, and to those who recognized it, it carried more disappointment than pride. There had once been money, influence, and land, or so the older relatives liked to remind each other during rare gatherings. By the time Lauren was born, all of that had dissolved, lipped away into stories no one bothered to verify. She had grown up on the edges of that family, related by blood but distant in every other way. Invitations arrived late or not at all. Phone calls were rare. Assistance was never offered, even when her life became a careful exercise in endurance after her son was born. It was precisely because of this long-standing distance that the letter felt unreal when it arrived. It was thick, formal, and bore the name of a law firm she did not recognize. She almost discarded it with the rest of the mail, assuming it was another bill or an offer she could not afford. Only when she noticed her own name typed neatly on the envelope did she pause. There was no emotion attached to that moment, no sudden sense of fate or anticipation, only confusion. The contents were brief and impersonal. A distant relative, long deceased in any meaningful sense, had formally passed away. The letter explained that Lauren was named as the sole beneficiary of a property. There was no expression of sympathy, no explanation of why she had been chosen, only an address and a request for contact. The property itself was described in the dry language of legal documentation, but one word stood out with almost absurd clarity: castle. Lauren reread the letter several times, convinced that fatigue had distorted her understanding. The idea felt incompatible with her reality. Castles existed in books, in photographs, in countries she had never visited. They did not exist in her life, between unpaid overtime and grocery lists calculated to the dollar. The letter did not suggest wealth or generosity. It offered no mention of money, no indication of value. It simply stated that ownership had transferred to her. She delayed responding, not out of excitement, but out of suspicion. The Hale family had never been known for generosity, especially toward her. There were cousins who lived comfortably, aunts and uncles who guarded their inheritance with quiet aggression. The notion that something substantial had been left to her alone felt less like a gift and more like a mistake. Or worse, a burden disguised as opportunity. When she finally contacted the law firm, the information she received only deepened her unease. The property was located in the mountains of West Virginia, far from any city she knew. It had been abandoned for decades. No one had lived there within living memory. Maintenance had ceased long ago, and the surrounding land had returned to wilderness. Local records listed it as an architectural curiosity with no commercial value. The tone used to describe it suggested pity rather than admiration. Lauren began to understand why the inheritance had come to her. It was not generosity, it was convenience. The property was unwanted, expensive to maintain, and legally complicated. Passing it to someone who had little means to contest the decision was efficient. She was not being elevated. She was being handed responsibility without consent. Despite this understanding, curiosity took hold. The idea that something bearing her family name still existed in physical form stirred something she had long ignored. She found herself searching for information late at night, reading fragmented articles and obscure references. The structure had once been known locally as a folly, a monument to excess built by an ancestor who had tried to import European grandeur into the American wilderness. It had never truly belonged, and over time, it had simply faded from relevance. The more she read, the more contradictions emerged. Some sources described the building as structurally sound despite its age. Others mentioned unexplained federal involvement during the mid-20th century, after which public references abruptly ended. There were no photographs newer than several decades, no tourist records, no restoration attempts. It was as though the place had been deliberately erased. The decision to visit was not heroic or dramatic, it was practical. Lauren needed to understand what she now owned, if only to determine how quickly she could distance herself from it. She arranged time off with difficulty, juggling schedules and obligations. The trip would cost money she did not have to spare, but ignorance felt more dangerous than the expense. She packed lightly, treating the journey as an inspection rather than an adventure. The drive carried her away from familiar highways and into increasingly narrow roads. Towns grew smaller, more spaced apart. Cell reception weakened, then vanished entirely. By the time she crossed into West Virginia, the landscape had changed into something older and quieter. Forests thickened, mountains rose and folded into one another. The sense of isolation deepened with every mile. Directions provided by the law firm were vague, relying on landmarks rather than addresses. Lauren followed them cautiously, aware that turning back would not bring clarity. The road eventually narrowed into gravel, then dirt. Trees pressed closer, branches arching overhead like an unspoken warning. The feeling that she was entering a place untouched by time settled heavily on her. When the forest finally opened, the sight that greeted her felt unreal. The structure rose from the land with an authority that contradicted every story she had heard. Massive stone walls stood intact, their surfaces softened by years of moss and ivy. Towers climbed toward the sky, their silhouettes sharp against the mountain backdrop. The building was not delicate or decorative. It was formidable, built to endure rather than impress. Lauren stopped the car and sat in silence, absorbing the scale of it. This was not a ruin in the way she had expected. It was neglected, yes, but not collapsed. The stonework appeared solid. The foundation showed no obvious signs of failure. Time had claimed the exterior, but it had not conquered it. The realization unsettled her. If the building still stood after all these years, then it was not the simple liability she had assumed. As she stepped onto the grounds, the air felt different, cooler and heavier. The silence was complete, broken only by distant wind through trees. There were no signs of recent habitation. No tracks, no vehicles, no indications that anyone had come this way for a long time. The place felt watched over rather than abandoned, as though neglect itself had become a form of protection. Inside, the impression deepened. The interior bore the marks of time, but also of intention. Furniture lay covered in dust, not smashed or stripped. Rooms were empty but orderly. The architecture spoke of deliberate design, of someone who had expected permanence. Lauren moved carefully, her steps echoing in vast halls that had once held life and purpose. It was during this first exploration that she noticed the detail that would stay with her long after she left. Amid doors left ajar and passages open to the elements, one door stood out. It was closed, secured, and unmistakably modern. The lock did not match the surrounding materials. It was new enough to feel intrusive, a contradiction embedded in stone. The discovery did not frighten her, but it unsettled her deeply. Abandonment explained decay, but it did not explain preservation. Someone had cared enough to secure something here long after the rest of the place had been left to nature. That realization followed her as she returned to her car, her thoughts heavy with questions she could not yet answer. As Lauren drove away, the image of the fortress lingered in her mind. The inheritance she had expected to dismiss had revealed itself as something far more complex. She had arrived believing she was dealing with a problem to be solved quickly. She left understanding that she had only begun to uncover the weight of what had been placed in her hands. The road back felt longer, and the certainty she had carried with her began to erode, replaced by an unease that hinted at a much larger story waiting to unfold. The memory of the stone fortress refused to loosen its grip on Lauren's thoughts after she returned to Pittsburgh. The image followed her through crowded streets and fluorescent-lit workplaces, intruding into moments that had once been governed entirely by routine. The inheritance had shifted from abstraction to physical reality, and with that shift came a sense of obligation she could neither name nor ignore. She found herself replaying details she had barely noticed at the time, reconstructing the experience piece by piece, as though understanding might emerge if she examined it closely enough. Within days, she realized that leaving the matter unresolved was no longer an option. The castle existed whether she wanted it to or not, and its presence demanded acknowledgement. The unanswered questions gnawed at her, growing heavier with each passing hour. She arranged another trip, this time with deliberate intent rather than hesitant curiosity. She prepared as one might prepare for an inspection of a difficult property, gathering practical supplies and documents, convincing herself that her purpose was still limited to assessment. The journey back felt different. The same roads carried her north and east, but the sense of uncertainty had been replaced by an uneasy familiarity. Each mile deeper into the mountains reinforced the impression that she was crossing into a space that did not operate by the same rules as her everyday life. The air grew cooler, the trees denser, the signs of modern habitation increasingly scarce. It was not merely isolation she felt, but separation, as though the land itself resisted connection to the outside world. When the forest opened once more, the fortress appeared with the same quiet dominance it had displayed before. Its stone walls rose without apology, vast and immovable, a structure that seemed to have grown from the mountain rather than been built upon it. Covered in layers of moss and climbing vines, it looked ancient despite its relatively recent origins. The towers stood like sentinels, their height emphasizing the smallness of the surrounding clearing. The building did not announce itself with grandeur so much as certainty. It was there to remain. Lauren parked at the edge of what had once been a circular drive, now cracked and uneven, grass and weeds reclaiming the space. As she stepped out of the car, she paused to absorb the stillness. There were no distant engines, no voices, no signs of nearby life. The forest pressed close, enclosing the structure in a living barrier that filtered sound and light alike. The fortress felt less abandoned than withdrawn, as if it had retreated deliberately from human attention. She began by walking the perimeter, careful to note the condition of the stonework and the terrain. The walls were thick and expertly laid, the craftsmanship evident even beneath decades of neglect. Where erosion might have been expected, the stone held firm. Ivy crept across the surface but did not appear to compromise the structure. In places, small trees had rooted themselves in crevices, their presence both alarming and oddly restrained, as though the building tolerated them rather than succumbed to them. The grounds bore traces of a design long overtaken by time, paths hinted at beneath layers of soil, low walls half swallowed by vegetation, remnants of gardens that had once been planned with care. There was no sign of recent intrusion, no tire tracks, no footprints, no evidence of vandalism or scavenging. The absence itself felt deliberate. Whatever had been left here had been left undisturbed. Entering the fortress once more, Lauren was struck again by the contrast between decay and endurance. Dust lay thick on stone floors, leaves gathered in corners where windows had broken long ago, and water stains marked ceilings where the roof had failed. Yet the vastness of the interior remained intact. The halls were still grand, their proportions unchanged, their purpose readable even in silence. The architecture spoke of permanence, of a builder who had expected the structure to outlast generations. She moved from room to room slowly, allowing herself time to observe rather than simply catalog. There were chambers that might once have been used for gatherings, others that suggested private quarters, and still others whose function was less obvious. Some rooms held furniture covered in protective cloths, as though someone had intended to return. Others were entirely bare, stripped not by theft but by time. The emptiness carried a strange dignity, as if the space itself remembered what it had been. Light entered unevenly, filtering through high windows and broken panes to create shifting patterns across stone and wood. In some areas the air felt damp and cold, heavy with the scent of earth and age. In others, it was surprisingly dry, preserved in a way that defied expectation. Lauren began to sense that the building had not been abandoned all at once. Its withdrawal from use had been gradual, selective, guided by decisions rather than chaos. The deeper she ventured, the stronger that impression became. Certain corridors showed signs of maintenance long after others had been left to crumble. Doors stood open where hinges should have seized long ago. Stairs remained passable, their steps worn but stable. It was as though the fortress had been reduced deliberately, sections sacrificed to time, while others were preserved. The logic behind those choices remained elusive, but their existence was undeniable. Inevitably, her exploration drew her back to the anomaly she had noticed during her first visit. The closed door remained unchanged, tucked away in a section of the fortress that otherwise bore clear signs of neglect. Its surface was clean compared to its surroundings, the wood unwarped, the metal fittings free of rust. The lock itself looked modern, manufactured with precision that stood in stark contrast to the hand-forged elements elsewhere in the building. Lauren examined it more closely this time, resisting the urge to touch it. The door was not reinforced in a way that suggested brute force protection. Instead, it conveyed restraint, an insistence on permission rather than resistance. Whatever lay beyond it had not been secured in haste. It had been sealed with intention, by someone who expected the barrier to remain effective. The presence of that door reframed everything she had seen. The fortress was not simply a relic of failed ambition or architectural excess. It was a container, a place designed not only to impress or endure, but to conceal. The idea unsettled her, stirring a sense of unease that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with human intent. She stepped back, allowing her gaze to travel once more across the interior spaces. The fortress no longer appeared random in its decline. It was curated neglect, decay allowed to progress in visible areas while certain elements were protected. The question was no longer whether something of value existed here, but why it had been hidden so thoroughly and from whom. As the afternoon light began to fade, Lauren found herself reluctant to leave. The building exerted a quiet pull, an invitation that felt both cautious and insistent. She recognized the danger in that feeling. Attachment could cloud judgment, and she could not afford sentimentality. Yet the fortress had already shifted her understanding of the inheritance. It was no longer merely an unwanted obligation. It was a mystery bound to her family name, one that demanded resolution. When she finally exited and closed the heavy entrance behind her, the forest seemed to absorb the sound without reaction. The fortress returned to its stillness, unchanged by her presence. Lauren walked back to her car with a sense of having crossed a threshold she could not retreat from entirely. The questions she carried with her were heavier now, layered with implications she did not yet grasp. As she drove away, the realization settled in with quiet certainty. The fortress was not abandoned because it had no value. It had been abandoned because its value was too great, too complicated, or too dangerous to confront openly. And whatever truth lay behind that locked door had already begun to shape her path forward, drawing her toward a history that refused to remain buried. The questions Lauren carried away from the fortress did not fade with distance. They deepened. What she had once hoped to reduce to a practical decision now refused to be simplified. The more she attempted to return to her former routines, the more intrusive the unanswered details became. The fortress had embedded itself in her thoughts, not as a curiosity, but as a presence that demanded acknowledgement. She began to understand that ignoring it would not restore her sense of balance. Something had already shifted, and the only way forward was through understanding. The first sign that her involvement was no longer private came sooner than she expected. Less than a week after her second visit, she received a call from a number she did not recognize. The voice on the other end was measured, confident, and precise. The caller identified himself as a representative of a private investment group with an interest in historical properties. He spoke as though their conversation were inevitable, as though her ownership of the fortress had already placed her on a predetermined path. The offer he presented was immediate and substantial. A purchase price far beyond what Lauren had imagined the property could be worth, accompanied by assurances of speed and discretion, no inspections, no delays, no public record beyond the bare minimum required by law. The tone was not aggressive, but it was insistent in a way that unsettled her. The man spoke as though he were solving a problem on her behalf, relieving her of a burden she did not yet fully comprehend. Lauren declined politely, citing the need for time. The response she received was courteous but sharpened by something beneath the surface. She was reminded, gently but unmistakably, that properties of this nature could attract complications. That ownership carried risks she might not be prepared to manage. The call ended with a suggestion rather than a threat, but the implication lingered long after the line went dead. It was then that Lauren understood the fortress was no longer just an inheritance. It was an asset being watched. Her unease intensified as she began to notice small changes around her. A car parked too long near her building. Emails that referenced the fortress before she had spoken publicly about it. Information that should not have traveled as quickly as it did had clearly done so. The realization that her actions were being observed brought with it a clarity she had been resisting. The value of the fortress was not theoretical. It was active, present, and known to others. Determined to regain some measure of control, Lauren turned to research. If the fortress carried significance beyond architecture, she would uncover it herself rather than allow others to define it for her. She began with public records, tracing property transfers, tax documents, and zoning classifications. The trail was fragmented but consistent in its omissions. Entire decades were missing. References ended abruptly, replaced by vague annotations that suggested federal involvement without elaboration. Local archives proved more revealing. In county libraries and historical societies, Lauren found newspaper clippings yellowed with age, articles written with the confidence of another era. They told the story of Edward Hale, a man described variously as visionary, eccentric, and reckless. He had built the fortress in the early 20th century, importing plans and techniques from Europe with little regard for cost or convention. The project had strained family resources and drawn public skepticism. The fortress had been labeled an indulgence, a symbol of excess disconnected from American practicality. Yet beneath the mockery lay hints of something more deliberate. Edward Hale had not been merely imitating European grandeur. He had been replicating specific architectural principles, incorporating reinforced stonework, isolated chambers, and design features that suggested utility beyond aesthetics. The fortress was not simply built to impress, it was built to protect. The articles grew darker as they approached the 1940s. During the early years of the Second World War, the fortress appeared in reports linked to federal requisitioning. Language became vague, careful. Phrases like strategic use and national interest replaced specifics. Photographs vanished. Names of departments were omitted. Then, without explanation, the references stopped entirely. The fortress disappeared from public discourse as though it had ceased to exist. Lauren sensed intention in that silence. Buildings of such scale did not simply vanish from record without cause. She expanded her search to regional and national archives, uncovering fragmented references to wartime programs focused on preservation and containment. Cultural assets, technological materials, items deemed too valuable or sensitive to leave exposed. Though the fortress was never named directly, its description matched the structure she had walked through with unsettling precision. Her research inevitably led back to Edward Hale himself. The man had been more than a builder. He had been a collector, a patron, and a participant in circles that intersected with government interests during a time of global instability. Letters referenced coordination with officials. Personal notes hinted at moral conflict. He had believed in preservation not as ownership, but as responsibility. The deeper Lauren dug, the more she understood why the fortress had been abandoned so carefully. It had not outlived its purpose. Its purpose had ended abruptly, unresolved. Whatever Edward Hale had overseen during the war had not concluded cleanly. There were gaps where records should have been, decisions that had been deferred rather than finalized. The modern offer to purchase the property took on new meaning in this context. The urgency, the secrecy, the warnings framed as concern. These were not the actions of collectors interested in stone and mortar. They were the actions of entities seeking control over something still contained within those walls. Lauren's thoughts returned again and again to the locked door. It had been sealed long after abandonment, maintained by someone who understood its importance. The fortress itself was not the object of desire. It was the container. The locked room was the key. The sense of being watched sharpened into certainty. She received another call, this time more direct. The offer increased. The tone shifted subtly from suggestion to expectation. She was advised again that prolonged ownership carried risks. The implication that she was unprotected, alone, and inexperienced was unmistakable. Rather than intimidating her, the pressure clarified her resolve. Selling now would not free her. It would leave her with unanswered questions and the knowledge that she had surrendered something significant without understanding it. Whatever lay hidden in the fortress was tied not only to her family's past, but to choices that still reverberated outward. Lauren returned to the mountains with a new perspective. She no longer approached the fortress as a reluctant heir or a cautious observer. She came as a custodian confronting a responsibility she had not sought but could no longer deny. The structure greeted her as it always had, silent and imposing, unchanged by the currents swirling beyond its walls. Inside, she walked familiar paths with heightened awareness. The fortress no longer felt merely old. It felt deliberate. Every preserved corridor, every intact chamber reinforced the idea that decay had been allowed selectively. This was not neglect born of apathy. It was neglect shaped by intention. Standing once more before the locked door, Lauren felt the weight of history pressing close. The fortress was no longer a mystery in abstract terms. It was a testament to decisions made under pressure, to values tested by circumstance. Edward Hale had built more than a monument to ambition. He had built a refuge for things that could not be trusted to the world as it was. Lauren understood now why the fortress had waited, why it had passed through generations without being claimed by those with wealth or power. It had not been left to chance. It had been left to someone overlooked, underestimated, and therefore free from the expectations that would have compromised it. As she turned away from the locked door, her course was set. She would uncover the truth contained within the fortress, not for profit or prestige, but to complete a story that had been suspended for decades. The forces circling the property were growing bolder, and time was no longer on her side. The hidden history she had uncovered was not content to remain buried, and neither, she realized, was she. Lauren returned to the fortress with a sense of purpose that was entirely new to her. The hesitation that had colored her earlier visits was gone, replaced by a quiet determination sharpened by knowledge. What had once felt like an inherited problem now stood before her as a responsibility that demanded action. The mountains seemed heavier with silence as she drove, the forest closing in with familiar indifference, as though the land itself recognized that she was no longer merely passing through. Inside the fortress, her movements were slower, more deliberate. She was no longer seeing the structure as a whole, but as a composition of details waiting to be understood. The architecture that had once appeared ornamental now revealed patterns, repetition, intent. Symbols carved into stone that mirrored one another across different sections of the building. What she had previously dismissed as decorative flourishes began to take on coherence, as though the fortress itself had been speaking in a language she had not yet learned to read. She began by retracing her earlier paths, not to rediscover what she already knew, but to observe what she had missed. Hallways aligned with one another in ways that suggested more than aesthetic preference. Rooms were positioned with consideration for isolation, sound, and concealment. The thickness of certain walls far exceeded structural necessity. Edward Hale had not built impulsively. Every choice had been calculated. Lauren's attention returned again and again to recurring motifs embedded in the stonework. Compass-like symbols appeared subtly throughout the fortress, sometimes worn almost smooth by time, sometimes preserved in corners untouched by erosion. They were not overt, not meant to draw the eye of a casual visitor, but once noticed, they became impossible to ignore. The same pattern repeated in different forms, carved, inlaid, or etched into surfaces meant to endure. The realization unsettled her. The fortress was not merely hiding something, it was guiding someone. She stood once more before the locked door, the modern mechanism incongruous against ancient stone. This time she did not approach it as an obstacle. She approached it as a culmination. Everything she had learned pointed here, to this precise barrier, maintained long after abandonment, protected by design rather than force. The lock bore markings that mirrored the compass symbols scattered throughout the fortress, subtle grooves and etchings that would have meant nothing without context. Lauren examined the door closely, resisting the urge to act too quickly. She ran her fingers along the edges, noting the care with which it had been installed. This was not a crude addition. It was an evolution of the fortress's original intent. Whoever had sealed this room had understood Edward Hale's language and had spoken it fluently. Her thoughts turned to inheritance, not as property, but as understanding. Edward Hale had not trusted wealth, influence, or authority. He had trusted continuity, the passage of meaning from one mind to another. The fortress itself was the message, and the locked room was its final punctuation. Lauren searched her belongings and retrieved the items she had carried with her from the beginning. Documents, keys, objects passed down through her family with no explanation attached. Among them was a heavy, ornate key she had inherited, along with the property deed, assumed to belong to the main entrance and nothing more. Until now, holding it in the dim light of the corridor, she noticed details she had overlooked. The handle bore the same compass motif, its edges worn smooth by hands long gone. The symbol was not merely decorative, it was functional. The key was not meant to fit as it was meant to be understood. Lauren examined the key with renewed focus, turning it slowly until she felt a slight shift beneath her fingers. A seam, nearly invisible, ran along the base of the handle. With careful pressure, the outer casing separated, revealing a smaller, simpler key hidden within. The design was elegant in its restraint. Only someone who knew to look would ever find it. The realization sent a shiver through her. Edward Hale had not hidden his greatest responsibility behind strength or secrecy alone. He had hidden it behind insight. Lauren returned to the door, her movements steady despite the pounding of her heart. The smaller key fit the lock perfectly, sliding into place with a precision that felt inevitable. She aligned the compass markings as she had seen them repeated throughout the fortress, adjusting the key until north met north. When she turned it, the mechanism responded smoothly, without resistance, as though it had been waiting. The sound of the lock disengaging echoed softly through the corridor, followed by a rush of air heavy with age. Lauren stepped back as the door opened inward, revealing not decay, but preservation. The room beyond was sealed against time in a way the rest of the fortress was not. The air smelled faintly of oil and paper rather than dust and stone. She stepped inside, her senses overwhelmed by the sudden shift. The space was smaller than she had imagined but dense with purpose. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their metal surfaces uncorroded. Tables stood arranged with deliberate order, covered in stacks of documents, maps, and photographs, protected beneath layers of cloth. Shelving units held objects carefully wrapped, labeled, and cataloged. At the center of the room stood a large covered structure. Lauren approached it slowly, lifting the protective fabric with reverence rather than haste. Beneath it lay framed works of art, their surfaces dulled only by time, not neglect. Even in the dim light, their quality was unmistakable. These were not reproductions or curiosities. They were originals, preserved with care and intention. Lauren moved through the room in a daze, opening drawers and folders, absorbing fragments of a story far larger than she had anticipated. Certificates of authenticity, provenance records, correspondence between collectors, museums, and government officials. Names she recognized appeared alongside stamps marked classified, now faded with age. Dates clustered around the early 1940s, a period of urgency and fear. The documents revealed the truth with relentless clarity. The fortress had served as a secret repository during the war, part of a program designed to protect cultural and historical assets from potential seizure or destruction. Private collectors and institutions had entrusted Edward Hale with their most valuable holdings, believing that the isolation and security of the fortress would keep them safe. But the story did not end there. As Lauren read deeper, a moral fracture emerged. Some of the works stored here had been stolen long before they reached American soil. They had been taken from families displaced or destroyed during the chaos of war. After the conflict ended, individuals claiming ownership sought to reclaim them, armed with documents that Edward Hale eventually recognized as fraudulent. Faced with the prospect of returning stolen heritage to collaborators and profiteers, Edward Hale had refused. He had hidden the most contested pieces, choosing secrecy over complicity. The government, unwilling to confront the complexity of the issue in the aftermath of war, had withdrawn, allowing the matter to remain unresolved. The fortress was sealed. The truth was buried. Lauren sank onto a chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. The interest shown by modern collectors and corporations made horrifying sense. These were not just valuable artworks. They were evidence, proof of crimes buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and time. Whoever controlled this room controlled a narrative that could reshape reputations and fortunes alike. As she sat there, absorbing the magnitude of what had been entrusted to her family, Lauren understood why Edward Hale had chosen patience over resolution. He had known the world was not ready to do the right thing. He had waited for someone who would be. The locked room was not a treasure vault in the conventional sense. It was a moral reckoning. And by opening it, Lauren had accepted a responsibility far greater than ownership. The fortress had not merely preserved objects. It had preserved a choice, one that now rested squarely in her hands. As she closed the door behind her, the silence of the fortress returned, unchanged and watchful. But Lauren was no longer the same person who had entered it. She carried with her the knowledge that the past was not finished with her, and that the choices she made next would determine whether the truth hidden within those walls would finally see the light. The knowledge Lauren carried out of the locked room altered the fortress around her, though nothing in its stone walls had physically changed. The corridors seemed narrower, the silence more deliberate, as if the structure itself were aware that its long vigil had ended. What had been hidden for decades now existed not only as preserved objects and documents, but as responsibility, immediate and unavoidable. Lauren understood with a clarity that left no room for denial that there would be no quiet resolution. The fortress had not been waiting to be sold or restored. It had been waiting to be answered. The first hours after the discovery passed in a haze of thought and motion. Lauren secured the locked room again, her movements careful and precise, aware that secrecy was no longer a matter of preference, but of survival. She reviewed the documents once more, committing names, dates, and symbols to memory. Every page reinforced the same conclusion. What Edward Hale had hidden was not merely valuable, it was dangerous to those who had benefited from its absence. The interest she had already encountered was only the surface of something far larger. The pressure escalated quickly. Within days, the calls resumed, no longer framed as polite offers but as expectations. The price rose dramatically, accompanied by assurances that selling would bring safety, closure, and anonymity. The language used suggested urgency not for her sake, but for theirs. Lauren recognized the shift for what it was. Patience had ended. The waiting watchers were preparing to act. Her sense of isolation deepened. The fortress, once remote, now felt exposed. Vehicles appeared on nearby roads more frequently. Figures lingered at a distance, never approaching directly, but never entirely absent. The realization that she was no longer merely being observed, but measured, forced her to confront the reality of her situation. She was standing between powerful interests and a truth they had long sought to control. Lauren did what Edward Hale had done decades before. She sought allies not in influence, but in principle. Rather than returning calls or negotiating terms, she contacted specialists whose work existed at the intersection of law, history, and restitution. Art repatriation attorneys responded with urgency that confirmed her fears. Federal agencies reacted with sudden intensity once she described the documents and artifacts contained within the fortress. What had been ignored for generations now demanded immediate attention. The response was swift, but not fast enough. The final attempt to intimidate her came without subtlety. Vehicles arrived unannounced, their presence unmistakably hostile. Men whose interest in the fortress was no longer masked by civility made it clear that the opportunity to choose had passed. They spoke not of purchase, but of entitlement, of ownership assumed rather than earned. Lauren refused to yield. The choice she made in that moment echoed Edward Hale's decades-old decision. She did not protect herself by surrendering responsibility. She protected the truth by exposing it. The arrival of federal authorities ended the confrontation before it could turn irrevocable, but the message had been delivered. Silence was no longer an option. What followed unfolded rapidly and publicly. Investigators secured the fortress and cataloged its contents with meticulous care. The documents Edward Hale had preserved proved irrefutable. They traced the movement of stolen cultural property, revealed false claims of ownership, and exposed networks that had profited from confusion and loss. The fortress became the center of a reckoning long delayed. The public narrative struggled to keep pace with reality. Headlines simplified what was complex, focusing on the spectacle of discovery rather than its substance. Yet beneath the noise, meaningful work was being done. Museums, governments, and surviving families were contacted. Provenance was established where possible. In cases where ownership could not be determined, ethical stewardship replaced profit-driven claims. Lauren remained present through it all, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant. She met with historians who treated the fortress with reverence rather than curiosity. She listened to families who spoke of losses that extended beyond material value. Each returned artifact carried weight far greater than its market price. They were pieces of identity restored after generations of absence. The legal outcomes unfolded over months rather than days. Corporations linked to illicit acquisition faced consequences. Individuals who had attempted to force control over the fortress found their influence diminished by exposure. The truth, once revealed, proved resistant to suppression. Edward Hale's decision to wait had not been futile. It had been precise. In the end, not everything was returned. Some items had no surviving claimants. Others had been lawfully acquired before the war and remained part of the Hale estate. Financial compensation followed, not as reward but as recognition of stewardship. The fortress itself was secured under Lauren's ownership, its future no longer uncertain. With the immediate crisis resolved, restoration began. Not as an attempt to erase the past, but to preserve it, the fortress was stabilized, repaired, and adapted with care. The locked room became a controlled archive, accessible to scholars and historians under strict oversight. Its purpose shifted from concealment to education. Lauren's life changed in ways she had never anticipated, yet the transformation was not rooted in wealth alone. She had not inherited fortune, she had inherited trust. The responsibility Edward Hale had carried alone was now shared openly, its burden lightened by truth. As she walked the restored halls, Lauren understood that legacy was not measured by what was possessed, but by what was protected. The fortress stood not as a monument to ambition or excess, but as evidence that integrity could endure even when recognition did not. The inheritance that had once seemed unwanted revealed its true cost and value only when fully claimed. It demanded courage, patience, and resolve. It required the willingness to stand alone long enough for the truth to catch up. In accepting that price, Lauren completed a story that had been waiting for her name to be written into it. The fortress had not been abandoned. It had been preserved. And now at last it had been answered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We share new stories like this every week, and the next one is already on the way. Be sure to check out the other videos on the channel for more unexpected inheritances, hidden histories, and stories that prove things aren't always what they seem. And if this story surprised you or moved you, share it with someone who loves a good mystery. You never know who might need a reminder that even the most overlooked places can hide something extraordinary.